There's a company that supplies the cheese on nearly every pizza you have ever ordered in America. Not some of them, nearly all of them. Pizza Hut, Domino's, Papa John's, Little Caesars. Every time one of those boxes lands on your doorstep, the mozzarella inside almost certainly came from a single company based in Denver, Colorado called Lupino Foods. Most Americans have never heard that name. That was entirely intentional. For decades, the company's founder refused to speak to reporters, avoided publicity, and built one of the most quietly dominant food businesses in the world. Forbes once described him as the billionaire you have never heard of. But in November 2024, Lupino Foods made a decision that was impossible to keep quiet. It shut down a 115-year-old California cheese plant, ended 368 jobs, and walked away from the state where it had processed milk for generations. The workers who showed up to that facility in Lemoore, California, had no warning. Some of their families had worked those floors for decades. And the reasons behind that closure, when you pull them apart carefully, reveal something much larger than one company making one business decision. They reveal the economic fault lines that are quietly reshaping where American food gets made, and who pays the price when those lines finally break. Before we go further, I want to point something out. More than 90% of viewers watching these economic documentaries haven't subscribed yet. If you're interested in understanding what's really happening behind America's factory closures, corporate relocations, and job losses, make sure to hit that subscribe button. This channel is dedicated to uncovering the deeper story behind the headlines. And while you're here, I'd like to know your opinion. Do you think more companies will continue leaving California over the next few years? Comment below. To understand what happened in Lemoore, you have to start with the company itself. Because Lupino Foods is not a business that most people can picture, even when they learn what it does. The scale is genuinely difficult to absorb. Approximately 1 billion pounds of cheese leave Lupino's plants every single year. The company consumes somewhere between 5 and 7% of the entire United States milk supply to produce it. Forbes ranked Lupino the 170th largest private company in America in 2024, with revenue sitting around $3.6 billion. A court filing from 2022 placed the company's total value near $5 billion. And yet, if you ask the average American to name the company behind their pizza cheese, almost none of them could do it. That invisibility was a deliberate strategy. No consumer brand means no consumer pressure. No public profile means no public scrutiny. Just volume, contracts, and market control so complete that removing Lupino from the American food system would be functionally impossible overnight. The origin of the company runs straight through the immigrant history of mid-century America. In 1950, an Italian immigrant named Mike Lupino Sr. opened a small grocery store in Denver's Sunnyside neighborhood, a working-class Italian community on West 38th Avenue. In the back of that store, he made ricotta and a traditional pear-shaped mozzarella called scamorza by hand. When the grocery closed in 1958, his son James made a decision that would define the next 7 decades. He focused everything on pizza cheese, starting with just $615 as his entire investment. The timing was not accidental. Pizza Hut, Domino's, and Little Caesars were all getting off the ground in that same era. James Lupino bet that pizza was going to become enormous in America. And he was right, in a way that very few entrepreneurs in any industry ever get to be right. He took over as chairman and CEO in 1972 and spent the next 5 decades building a company that would eventually control the majority of an entire food category. James Lupino passed away on June 19, 2025, at 87 years old, just months after the California plant he had built his empire around began its final chapter. The Lemoore facility sat in Kings County, California, in the flat, irrigated farmland of the Central Valley, about 30 miles south of Fresno. That specific site had been in continuous dairy operation since 1910, well before any living person was born. Lupino acquired it in the 1980s and eventually operated 2 plants in the area. Lemoore East, the older facility at the center of this story, and Lemoore West, a newer plant built in 2003 at a cost of $300 million. Together, those two facilities processed roughly 14 million pounds of milk every single day and turned out approximately 1.5 million pounds of mozzarella daily. To put that in terms most people can picture, that is enough cheese from just those two California plants to supply roughly 2 million large pizzas every single day. The operation was not a marginal presence in that community. It was a cornerstone. Workers whose fathers and grandfathers had hauled milk cans into that facility showed up to the same floors, running the same processes, drawing the same paychecks that had sustained families across generations in a region where good-paying factory work was never easy to find. On November 14, 2024, Lupino Foods announced it was shutting Lemoore East down permanently. The company's official statement listed 5 reasons for the closure: the age of the facility itself, the anticipated cost of upgrading or replacing aging equipment, high operating costs in California, uncertainty about the long-term milk supply in the region, and the opening of a new $1 billion plant in Lubbock, Texas. The initial announcement referenced roughly 300 workers, but California's worker adjustment and retraining notification filings, the legal disclosures companies are required to submit before mass layoffs, told a fuller story. 2 separate filings recorded 368 total affected positions. The first, submitted in October 2025, listed 268 layoffs taking effect January 9, 2026. A second filing in December 2025 added 100 more positions ending by December 30, 2026. These were not abstract numbers on a regulatory document. They were people. Dave Costa had worked at that plant for 35 years. His words after the announcement are worth sitting with directly. "This is the highest paying job in the valley," he said. "This is going to devastate the community of Lemoore. Not getting all these taxes that have been coming in over the years because of this plant, it's going to put a hurt on the city of Lemoore big time. You worked so hard all those years for your retirement, and then all of a sudden, they shut it down." Lemoore's mayor, Patricia Matthews, described the announcement as just kind of a shock, nothing that anyone expected. Those reactions were not the responses of people who had been watching warning signs accumulate. They were the responses of a community that believed an institution was permanent, right up until the moment it was not. Kings County was not positioned to absorb this kind of loss quietly. Unemployment in the county was running at 8.9% as of mid-2025, more than 50% above California's state average and nearly double the national rate. Median household income sat around $74,000, and approximately 12% of residents lived below the poverty line. The Lupino closure did not arrive in isolation either. A Del Monte Foods facility in nearby Hanford had just announced its own shutdown, eliminating 378 jobs. An Olam processing plant had already closed earlier. Kings County Supervisor Richard Valle organized a job fair at the Lemoore Civic Auditorium to connect displaced workers with over 20 potential employers. It was a decent gesture, but a job fair is a modest response to a structural problem, and everyone involved knew it. To understand why a 115-year-old operation shuts down, you have to understand what California actually costs a large manufacturer in the current environment, because the numbers are not close, and they have not been close for a long time. Start with electricity, which is the operating cost that hits food processors harder than almost anything else. According to U.S. Energy Information Administration data from 2024, California's industrial electricity rate runs at 21.53 cents per kilowatt hour. Texas comes in at 6.12 cents. That means California electricity costs roughly 3.5 times more than Texas electricity for the same power. For a mozzarella plant running refrigeration systems, pasteurization equipment, and processing lines around the clock, every single day of the year, that differential does not get absorbed quietly into a balance sheet. It compounds over months and years into a number that eventually forces a decision. Taxes deepen the gap further. California levies a flat corporate income tax of 8.84% and carries the highest top personal income tax rate in the entire country at 13.3%. Texas collects no corporate income tax at all, only a franchise tax capped at 0.75%, and charges no personal income tax whatsoever. California's minimum wage stood at $16.90 per hour effective January 2026. Texas operates at the federal floor of $7.25 per hour. Stack all of those cost layers together, and the structural picture facing a large employer in California's Central Valley looks fundamentally different from what a competitor operating in West Texas would face. It is not one disadvantage, it is a cascade of them, each one individually manageable, together forming something that is eventually impossible to argue against on a spreadsheet. Water regulation is where the story becomes more complicated and more troubling for anyone who depends on California agriculture for their livelihood. The Sustainable Groundwater Management Act placed the Tulare Lake Subbasin, the agricultural core of Kings County, on state probation in April 2024. It was the first time that designation had ever been applied anywhere in California. New fees followed immediately: $300 per well, plus $20 per acre-foot of groundwater pumped, layered on top of existing local fees. University of Maryland researchers estimated that meeting the law's full compliance targets could function as an effective 60% tax on groundwater use, and could ultimately fallow around 1 million San Joaquin Valley acres, removing them from agricultural production entirely. When Lupino's closure statement referenced uncertainty about the long-term milk supply outlook in California, that phrase was pointing directly at this problem without naming it outright. Because the connection is straightforward and unavoidable. If the dairy farm supplying your plant cannot afford water, your plant eventually runs dry. The cheese operation does not fail because of its own inefficiency. It fails because the agricultural ecosystem feeding it is being systematically squeezed out of viability. Then, in late August 2024, a biological disaster landed on top of everything else that was already straining the system. The H5N1 bird flu virus appeared in California dairy herds and spread with alarming speed. By mid-December 2024, 645 of California's 1,700 dairy herds were infected. That is roughly 60% of the entire state industry struck by a single outbreak in a matter of months. Governor Newsom declared a state of emergency on December 18, 2024. Infected cows typically drop milk production by 20 to 30%, with recovery taking months in most cases. California's November 2024 milk output fell 9.2% compared to the prior year, the largest single-month decline ever recorded in the state's history. For the full year 2024, California dairy production declined 1.5%, and the United States as a whole lost dairy output for 2 consecutive years, the first time that had happened since the 1960s. This was the environment in which Lupino announced it was finished with Lemoore East. Not a healthy industry absorbing a manageable setback. A stressed industry absorbing a catastrophic one. One more regulatory layer still sits on the horizon, and its implications for California's remaining dairy and food processing sector are significant. California Senate Bill 1383, signed into law in 2016, requires a 40% cut in dairy and livestock methane emissions below 2013 levels by 2030. Dairy and livestock together account for more than half of California's total methane output. The California Air Resources Board directed staff in September 2024 to begin formal rulemaking in 2025, with binding standards potentially taking effect by 2030. For cheese processors dependent on a steady and affordable milk supply from California dairies, that deadline represents another cost layer arriving on an industry that is already operating under serious strain. The regulatory calendar does not pause because the economic conditions are difficult. It moves forward regardless, and the companies making long-term capital decisions factor that forward motion into their calculations. Texas, meanwhile, had been making a very different argument for 3 full years before the California closure announcement ever came. On October 1, 2021, Governor Greg Abbott announced that Lupino Foods had chosen Lubbock, Texas for a brand new greenfield manufacturing facility, the first Lupino plant ever built in that state. That date matters enormously because it falls 3 years before the California shutdown. Lupino was not reacting to California's collapse. They were executing a long-term strategic repositioning, and California's problems simply made the exit easier to execute and easier to explain publicly when the time came. The original investment figure for the Lubbock plant was $870 million. Construction inflation pushed the final total to approximately $1 billion. The facility sits on 258 acres in East Lubbock, covers roughly 850,000 square feet, and processes around 500,000 gallons of milk per day, with approximately 200 milk tankers arriving on site daily. Texas and local officials assembled an incentive package specifically designed to land the deal. The Texas Enterprise Fund contributed $4.2 million directly from the governor's office. The city of Lubbock approved approximately $22 million in tax abatements over 10 years. A land grant valued at roughly $1.97 million transferred 258 acres to Lupino. A job creation incentive offered $10,000 per position for up to 674 jobs. A capital investment incentive worth $19.3 million offset the cost of the plant's water treatment facility. Road improvements and infrastructure upgrades added several million more. The Lubbock Economic Development Alliance and Lupino together project a $10.6 billion economic impact on Texas over the next 10 years. Phase 1 of the facility opened with a ribbon cutting on January 15, 2025, just 2 months after the California closure announcement came down. The milk supply surrounding the new Texas plant is not a coincidence or a convenience. It is the product of a migration that has been underway for 2 decades. The Texas Panhandle produces 75 to 80% of all Texas milk, with Hartley County alone accounting for about 19% of total state output. And notably, many of the dairies now supplying the Lubbock plant are owned and operated by former California dairy farmers who relocated to Texas over the past 20 years, driven out by the same combination of water costs, electricity prices, and regulatory burden that eventually pushed Lupino itself to make the same move. The cheese followed the cows, and the cows had already left. Lupino is not an isolated case. Chief Executive Magazine has surveyed hundreds of senior executives annually for more than 20 consecutive years. For all 20-plus of those years, Texas has ranked first for business conditions, and California has ranked last. Not occasionally, every single year. The 2026 survey found 54% of respondents open to exploring relocation. Del Monte Foods is closing its Hanford, California facility, eliminating 378 jobs. Hilmar Cheese expanded into Dodge City, Kansas in 2025, rather than reinvesting in California. Olam exited California tomato processing entirely. The pattern is not ambiguous. It is consistent, directional, and accelerating. California's defenders make arguments that deserve to be heard, because they are not wrong about everything. New business registrations in the state reached around 291,000 in 2024. California leads the entire country in venture capital investment. The California Competes tax credit recently awarded nearly $100 million across 9 companies for over 2,700 jobs. The H5N1 outbreak was a biological event, not a policy choice, and its worst effects may prove temporary over time. These are legitimate points, and they matter for certain industries in certain locations, particularly technology, biotechnology, entertainment, and high-value professional services. The problem is that none of those advantages change the arithmetic for a company like Lupino Foods. A plant standing since 1910 needs hundreds of millions in capital upgrades, regardless of anything else. Electricity costs 3.5 times more than in Texas. The farms supplying raw milk are absorbing new water fees while simultaneously recovering from a 60% infection rate. And on the other side of the ledger, a competing state is offering a brand new billion-dollar facility, a growing and geographically concentrated milk supply, and tens of millions in direct government incentives to come. California is excellent at attracting the economy of the future. It is becoming increasingly expensive for the economy of the present. Lemoore East is finishing out its final months. 115 years of dairy history on that site will close out in 2026. 368 workers are either already gone or counting down their remaining shifts. A community that entered this chapter already under serious economic pressure has lost one of its most important and highest-paying employers. And the company that started with a $615 investment in Denver's Little Italy has placed its future squarely in West Texas, surrounded by a milk supply built by farmers who made the same calculation years before Lupino did. What happened in Lemoore is not a single story about a single plant. It is one clear and well-documented data point in a larger transformation that is quietly redrawing the map of American food production, shifting jobs, tax revenue, and economic weight from one region to another, one closure announcement at a time. The workers at Lemoore East lived with the outcome of that competition whether they ever followed the policy debates or not. They simply showed up, did the work, and one day learned that the math had moved on without them. Before you leave, I want to thank you for watching this report all the way through. But I also want to remind you that over 90% of viewers still haven't subscribed yet. If you enjoy these in-depth stories about economic change, business decisions, and the industries reshaping America, please hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps this channel continue growing. And before you go, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Do you think more companies will follow Lupino's path out of California in the coming years? Let me know in the comments below.